There are moments in life when we stand at the crossroads of choice, where a single decision can change everything we know about ourselves and the world we thought we understood. I stood at one of those moments when a man, as big as the mountains that surrounded us, offered me a future I never imagined. One word, one proposition, and suddenly, everything felt like it was spinning too fast. If you've ever been caught in a moment like that, where everything shifts and nothing feels certain, this story will hit home. But if you're ready to dive in, to see where this unexpected path leads, don't forget to like and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. The wind had a way of carving through the land, relentless and untamed, sweeping the dry earth across the endless expanse. My farm, my father's farm, stood stoic in the face of it, a small, stubborn patch of green that refused to bow to the fury of the prairie. And I, Anna Gallagher, had learned to stand just as strong. At 24, I was a woman made of dust and sweat, of hard work and silent sacrifices, a girl who had long since put aside any dreams of fairy tale endings or fanciful love. I had my hands in the soil, my heart in the land, and a future that was all too real, one where survival meant doing the things no one told you you'd have to, where hope could be a fleeting thing if you weren't careful. Orphaned at a young age, I'd learned early that no one was coming to save me. My father had been a good man, a hard worker, but the harsh winters had taken him, just as they had taken so many others. The years of struggle had molded me into a woman who no longer believed in fairy tales, a woman who knew that life was a matter of endurance, grit, and a little bit of luck. The people in town, small-minded and often unforgiving, didn't make life easier, especially as I became the subject of their whispered pity, their narrow-eyed looks when I passed. They said I was strong or brave for carrying on, but none of them ever understood what it was really like, what it cost me every single day to wake up, face the cold, and force my hands to do what needed to be done. I had learned to trust no one but myself and the land beneath my feet. But even the land can be treacherous, and there are times when you don't realize how much you're sinking until you're already in too deep. That's when he came, Boaz Cutter, a giant of a man, stepping off his horse like he owned the world. His silhouette loomed in the doorway of my barn, a shadow stretched by the unforgiving sun, his boots clicking with the authority of a man used to taking what he needed and giving nothing back. I had heard of him before, stories spun in town about his success, his wealth, his untamed ranch. He was the kind of man you'd think twice about crossing, with a reputation that stretched beyond the borders of the county. The men in town feared him, the women whispered about him, but I had never met him until that day. He wasn't the kind of man you expect to show up on your doorstep with anything less than a purpose, and that's exactly what he did. He stood there, the weight of the world on his broad shoulders, his eyes hard as stone, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need a wife," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters." His words hit me like a slap. I blinked, trying to make sense of the absurdity of it all. Was this a joke? Was I meant to laugh? I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't try to charm me with polite words or false flattery. No, this man came to me with the same blunt honesty I'd always tried to live by, and I hated him for it. I hated him for seeing me as nothing more than a means to an end, as if my life, my dreams, my struggles were all just pieces to fit into some cold, practical equation he had devised. But there was something about him, something in the way he held himself, something in those dark eyes, that made me hesitate. He didn't see me as weak, as many did, and for the first time in years, I wondered if there was more to my life than surviving. Still, I didn't trust him. I didn't trust his offer, his motives, or the strange sense of familiarity that came with hearing him speak of a life I had long since resigned myself to, one of hard work and solitude. The truth was, the winters here were long, and the land was unforgiving. Without help, I was barely making ends meet. I had no family, no one to turn to, and the thought of facing another winter alone terrified me more than I cared to admit. Yet, the idea of marrying him, of becoming someone's property, no matter how practical the arrangement, felt as foreign to me as the idea of a kind fairy tale. But as he stood there, waiting for an answer, the wind howling around us, I realized there was no choice. My land was my future, and if I was to keep it, If I was to survive another year in this harsh place, I had to do something bold, something that broke all the rules. And in that moment, Boaz Cutter, the giant cowboy, had given me an escape from the life I'd been forced to accept. This proposal wasn't romantic. It wasn't even kind. It was a matter of survival. Yet, in the strange, quiet corner of my mind, something about it stirred, a flicker of hope, as fleeting and fragile as a candle in the wind. I agreed. Not for love, not for some grand dream of a shared future. I agreed because it was the only way forward. And the next words out of his mouth were the ones that set the course for everything that would follow. "Winter's coming hard this year," he said. "And some decisions get harder the longer you wait to make them." I thought of the cold that would surely come, of the snow that would blanket my fields, and I knew then that life would never be the same. I had made my choice, and the consequences, whatever they may be, would follow me, just as the winter would come whether we were ready or not. The days that followed were strange, a blur of new routines and a growing unease I couldn't quite shake. The man I had married wasn't cruel, at least not in the way most people would understand. Boaz Cutter didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always with purpose. His presence was constant, like the towering peaks that stood over the valley, ever watchful and steady. We settled into a rhythm on the ranch, one that blurred the line between familiarity and discomfort. Boaz worked the land with a quiet intensity, while I managed the house, tending to the animals and the fields in ways I hadn't imagined before. It wasn't a life I had ever envisioned, but it was one that demanded everything from me, leaving little room for doubt. Most of the time, we didn't speak unless it was necessary. The silence between us was thick, but not unbearable. At first, I found solace in it, the quiet giving me space to breathe and think. But as the days stretched on, that same silence began to feel heavier, like a weight pressing down on me. I was beginning to question everything about our arrangement. Was this truly what I wanted? What had I given up in exchange for the security of his land? In the darkest corners of my mind, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if this cold partnership could ever become anything more than what it was, a matter of survival, a contract of convenience. But it was the smallest things that began to stir something in me, things I had never expected from him. Like the way Boaz would take an extra moment to adjust the blankets when he saw me cold, or the careful way he tended to the horses, whispering to them like old friends. He didn't show affection, not in the way I thought I'd always dreamed of, but there was a quiet respect in his actions that made me pause. It wasn't love, but it was something real. And that something kept me from running, kept me from walking away when the weight of it all started to feel too heavy. One evening, after a long day working the fields, Boaz took a seat by the fire, his gaze lost in the flames. I joined him, sitting a bit farther away than I normally would, careful to maintain the distance between us. For a long while, neither of us spoke. But then, unexpectedly, he turned to me, his voice gruff but steady. "You're a strong woman, Anna." His words startled me, cutting through the silence like a blade. "I've seen it in the way you handle this place. You're not like the others." I had no idea how to respond, so I simply nodded, unsure of what to say. But in that moment, something shifted. The walls between us, however small, began to crack, just a little. There was respect between us now, something deeper than the businesslike arrangement we had started with. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The nights grew colder, and the winter winds began to creep in, carrying the promise of snow. And as I stood on the porch one night, looking out at the vast, empty land stretching before me, I couldn't help but wonder if the same coldness that had come between Boaz and me would slowly fade as the seasons changed. Could something more grow between us? Something that had nothing to do with practicality or survival. For the first time since we'd married, I allowed myself to hope, just a little. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that, no matter how much we learned about each other, we were still two people bound by necessity. Nothing more, nothing less. And as the days wore on, I couldn't help but wonder if I was foolish for thinking that something more could ever come from this cold, calculated union. But the truth was, no matter what I felt, I had made my choice. And now, the only question left was whether I could live with it. Winter was upon us, blanketing the land in a thick, unforgiving layer of snow. The ranch, once wide open and full of possibilities, now seemed small and contained, wrapped in the icy grip of the season. The days were long and cold, and the nights even colder, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls like a living thing. Inside, we kept to our routines, and our silences were punctuated only by the sounds of work, chopping wood, feeding the animals, tending to the house. It wasn't the life I had ever dreamed of, but it was a life. And for the first time in years, it was a life I didn't have to face alone. Boaz, despite his stoic nature, had a way of making me feel that I was part of something bigger than just surviving. There were moments, small and fleeting, when he would look at me with something that wasn't cold or indifferent, but not quite affection either. It was respect, admiration, perhaps, and even though I didn't dare to name it, I felt the stirrings of something in me, a flicker of hope, a possibility that maybe this life, this marriage, wasn't as hollow as I had feared. One evening, after a long day of battling the wind and snow, I found myself by the fire, stirring a pot of stew while Boaz sat across from me, sharpening his knife. The flickering firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines carved by years of hard labor and solitude. He didn't speak much, but tonight was different. He put the knife down, wiped his hands on his pants, and for the first time, looked at me like he was really seeing me. "Anna," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You've been here for months now. You've handled more than I expected." His words were simple, but there was an honesty in them that made my chest tighten. I paused, unsure how to respond. But before I could say anything, he added, "You're not like the others. The others. The ones who had tried to marry him, to get his attention, the ones who saw his wealth as their ticket to comfort." Boaz had never been interested in them, and I was beginning to understand why. I wasn't interested in his money. I wasn't interested in anything other than surviving, alone, independent, and free. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. We weren't so different after all. We both knew the value of hard work, the worth of doing things with your own hands, the dignity in struggle. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," I said, my voice steady. "Just like you." His lips curved into something like a smile, though it was brief and fleeting. There was a warmth there, just beneath the surface, and I felt it. A connection, not of love, but of respect. That was enough for me. As winter dragged on, something subtle began to change between us. We began to share more than just the daily tasks of running the ranch. We started talking, not just about work, but about things that mattered. The land, the past, the future. I told him stories of my childhood, of my father's quiet strength, of the farm I had once dreamed of building with him. And he, in turn, shared fragments of his life, his family, his time on the ranch, the battles he had fought and lost. It wasn't much, but it was real. The snow kept falling, and the land kept stretching out before us, vast and silent, as if waiting for something. I began to wonder what it would be like to stay here, in this small house, with this man who had become, in some strange way, a part of my world. We weren't in love, not by the definition I once knew, but we had something growing between us. A partnership, a bond forged by survival and hard work, and maybe, just maybe, something more. But even as I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this life could be enough, that maybe this man, this marriage, could be something worth holding on to, I knew there was still something we hadn't addressed. The land, the future. We were still bound by necessity, by the harsh realities of the world we had chosen. And no matter how much we had come to rely on each other, the question remained, could this partnership, built on practicality, ever become something deeper, something that didn't just exist to get us through the winters, but to build a life worth living? I didn't have the answer. But as I looked across the fire at Boaz, his quiet presence offering me something I hadn't had in years, comfort, stability, respect, I realized I wasn't alone in the uncertainty. He didn't have the answers either. But we were facing it together, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, the snow continued to fall, but inside the house, there was warmth. Real warmth, the kind that didn't come from the fire alone. It was the warmth of two people, still unsure of everything but willing to face it side by side. And for the first time, I wondered if this life, this strange, unexpected marriage, could be something I could learn to love.